It's been years since anyone's found any new debris from MH370, and it's been even longer than that since anyone came up with any other sort of new evidence relating to the case. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible that we could find new data. We could find new evidence that would shine light on the fate of MH370. Might sound a little far-fetched, but hear me out. I've been thinking a lot, I've been doing research, and I've been talking to experts who collect this kind of data. And what they're telling me is that it isn't just feasible, but they actually think it's quite an interesting and intriguing idea. All of which is to say is that I'm extremely excited about today's show. I'm going to be talking with a really bright guy. His name is Andy Sybrandy. He is the founder and president of a company called Pacific Gyre, which makes the sensors and transmitters for the collection of marine data. I'll explain more in a little bit. After the interview, if it sounds interesting to you, I'd like you to stick around because there's ways that you, the viewer and listener, can help out if you're interested. Hi everybody, Jeff Wise back with you. Right now, I'm getting close to a big subscriber level of 1,000, which makes a big difference for the algorithm. So I ask you this every time, but right now, particularly, if you like this show and you're not already subscribed and you want to go ahead and hit that subscribe button, it would mean a lot. Thank you. Now let's talk about this new evidence that I was mentioning earlier. Basically, I spent a lot of time in this podcast talking about the flaperon and other pieces of debris that washed across the Indian Ocean in the months after the plane disappeared in 2014 into 2015 that ultimately were collected in the western part of the Indian Ocean. In particular, the flaperon was the most rich in marine organisms that provide evidence of what happened to the plane. But there were some very peculiar things about the flaperon. I've enumerated them here before, but let me summarize again. Number one, the age of the barnacles. The barnacles were much smaller than the scientists who study these things would expect. And that means that they are younger. In the anniversary episode in season 1, we talked about how there was about a year-long gap between when the plane disappeared and when these organisms seemed to start colonizing the flaperon in particular. But none of the pieces of debris that were collected, and dozens were collected, none of them had organisms that were the right age. They were all way too young. Why? Number two, the second strange aspect of this data is how the Lepus barnacles settled on the flaperon. When the French authorities took the piece from Réunion to Toulouse, where they examined it, they were kind of baffled because when they put it in the tank, they saw how it floated about 1/3 out of the water. But when they looked at the Lepus barnacles, these barnacles, which grow only underwater, completely covered the piece. Though that's contradictory, and they were really baffled, and they wound up doing their reverse drift modeling using two sets of assumptions based on either it was fully immersed or it was floating partly out of the water. That paradox has never been resolved. And then three, which relates to number two, is how did the flaperon drift from the presumed crash site to Reunion Island in the 15 months that it took? When the Australian scientists ran their drift models, they couldn't get the piece to arrive at Reunion in time. They thought it had to do with the wind, the way the wind pushed the object, and basically, it had to stick up high enough out of the water that the wind could push it. But again, that's the paradox because it seems to have been floating immersed enough that the Lepus could grow in it. The Australians were aware of this difficulty, and so what they did is they took it, they created some replica flaperons, sort of like their model of what a flaperon is. It kind of looked like a shipping pallet, and they put it in the water when it was a windy day, and they measured how the wind affected it. And then they did their calculations and they couldn't get it to work. The wind didn't push it enough to get to Reunion Island. So they got an actual flaperon. They cut it down to the size to match what was the piece of debris that washed ashore. And they put it in the ocean and they saw how the wind pushed it. And they found that it pushed it more than the early replicas they'd made. And then when they put those numbers into their algorithm, it produced the results they wanted. The piece was now able to get to Reunion Island in time. Great. But for me, when I heard about this, I was a little bit frustrated because they just left the piece in for a couple hours, long enough that they could study the effect of the wind. If they had just left it in and let it drift, especially if they had put it in on the 7th arc, near where they think the plane went into the water, they could have actually seen, they could have answered some of these other paradoxes, such as how did the barnacles grow and how big were the barnacles? So essentially, the idea that I've been talking to people about is, what if we get a flaperon, as the Australians did, and we put it in the ocean on the anniversary, so the seasonality is correct, put it in the ocean near the 7th arc, and we let it drift, and we track it, and we see where it goes, and either we can attach a camera and we can watch the marine life growing on it to see if it somehow does grow all over the entire thing, and we can also see how big they're getting. And hopefully, after 15 months, sometime in July of, this would be 2026, we could pull it out of the water, whatever sea life is growing on it, and measure it, see what it is. That would really help clarify this paradox. Either these paradoxes aren't paradoxes, there's some way that it actually makes perfect sense, or we have a fundamental problem. Because if the sea life grows on this replica flaperon in a very different way to how it grew on the real flaperon, we have some real questions. Okay, and then I think the world has to finally acknowledge that this is really a problem for the idea that the plane went into the Southern Ocean. We have to really back out and take a clean sheet approach to trying to understand this mystery, as I've been obviously proposing for a long time. So if this idea were to be implemented, there would be essentially 3 stages, right? We have to first of all find a flaperon. We then have to cut it down to the size of the flaperon that washed ashore. And we have to outfit it with telemetry. We have to put sensors on it and a way to communicate with satellites so we can track it as it moves through the ocean. And then the final step is, having created this rig, we have to put it in the water on March 8th, 2025, 1,000 miles from Perth. So it's out there in the middle of the ocean. It's not that easy to get to. So all of these steps are difficult to some degree, but doable. And so I've spent the last couple weeks, months actually, thinking about how to effectuate all of these things. And today I'm going to be talking with Andy Sybrandy, who, as I mentioned, developed the drifters that NOAA is currently deploying all around the world in its global drifter program. And he builds the sensors that go on these things. So nobody knows more about collecting data from the middle of the ocean and tracking things that are moving thousands of miles from land in a random direction. Nobody knows more about that stuff than Andy Sybrandy. So I'm really happy to welcome him onto the podcast today. Well, let's just get into it. Andy, thank you so much for taking the time. I was hoping you could start by telling me a little bit about yourself. You have an interesting background. You've been working with oceans and instrumentations for a long time now.
Yeah, since 1989, I started working with Peter Neeler. He's sort of the patriarch of Lagrangian drifting buoys. He and I designed the SVP drifter, which is used as sort of the workhorse of the global drifter program.
So you were building these instruments in order to collect data from the ocean?
Yeah. So they're drifting buoys. They collect GPS positions and transmit it back through satellites, and they're sort of a proxy for the current itself. They follow the currents.
Okay, so what I'm interested in, the question of, can we collect more data that would help shed some light on some of these mysterious aspects of MH370, evidence that we have in hand but don't fully understand. So it would be neat if we could put, say, a flaperon into the ocean near where we think the real flaperon went in, and then track a couple of things, track its motion, track the growth of marine organisms on it, and see if we can maybe see what happens when we replicate the experience of the real life flaperon that happened back in 2014. And so I had talked to you earlier, we had a phone conversation, and I put these questions to you, and you had some really interesting things to say to me. I mean, the first thing I wanted to know was, if we took a real-life flaperon and put it in the ocean, what kind of instrumentation would we put on it? And you were telling me about the transmitters that go on these drifter buoys. They are. Could you tell me sort of about how big they are, how much they weigh, and what kind of data are they transmitting?
Okay, so for the drifters, there's the SVP drifter has a 14-inch sphere, which is batteries, a GPS receiver, and a satellite transmitter inside the sphere. That hangs onto a drogue that's centered at 15 meters below the surface, a drogue being the sea anchor.
Okay.
So a 14-inch sphere is required for that. Now, in some of our smaller drifters, we use an 8-inch sphere, and that's also the sphere we use when people ask us, they want to track something in the water. So they'll use this 8-inch sphere, which has smaller batteries. It won't affect what it's attached to as much, and it's just a lighter, less expensive solution.
And it has a smaller battery, so it won't last as long.
It won't last as long, but it will last. I mean, the SVP drifter will last several years in the water.
Right.
The MicroStar is another float. That's where the 8-inch surface float comes from. It'll last for many months, depending on how often you sample the positions. So if you sample every 5 minutes, it won't last as long as if you sample every hour.
I think the global drifters that NOAA manages report every hour or something like that.
Yeah, they report every hour, and they'll last. They have enough battery power to last for 4 or 5 years.
4 or 5 years.
Yeah,
Wow.
which is more than you'll probably need for.
That is plenty of time. I mean, basically, the project that I have in mind would be to replicate a 15-month drift across the kind of mid-latitudes of the
Indian Ocean.
Of the southern Indian Ocean, which, depending on where you drift to, could be really prime habitat for these lepus barnacles. So these are transmitting location and sea surface temperature, right?
Yeah.
And I had asked you about, well, what if you could get other parameters like wind speed? Now, wind speed is very relevant for how things drift if they poke up out of the water. The flaperon is believed to have pitched up out of the water quite significantly. And when the Australian officials carried out their modeling, they could only get their modeling to...
They could model the drift if they used the wind as a significant force. Yeah.
Exactly, if they use the wind. So it'd be interesting to know what the wind is, but you said that can be problematic to measure.
Yeah, well, I mean, so in order to measure wind, you need an anemometer, which is, you have to kind of hold it vertical in the wind. And so a small float the wind would blow it over,
Right.
So we do measure wind speed and direction from SVP drifters, the big global drifter program drifters.
So the flaperon would be really hard to fix an anemometer to because it's bistable. It has two orientations that it can float in, and it tends to, if there's any significant wave action, it flips back
around.
And forth.
Yeah.
So I think we can have to rule that one out. The other thing I had this idea of if you could somehow attach a camera and then you could watch the sea life growing. One of the really perplexing aspects of the real flaperon is that it was completely covered in lepus barnacles, and there seems to be some dispute as to whether that's possible or not. And this would really settle that once and for all, but I think it sounds like a camera would just use up way too much data and too much power.
I mean, if we use a larger surface float, which would work with more batteries, and then we can hang a camera below the float, which we've done with moored sensor chains in the past.
So you've got a chain that's being held up.
They did it for exactly that same reason, which is to look and see. The camera was deeper in their case, and they were looking. They actually I had suggested they put a camera on there because who knows. And then they put the camera on there, and it was like it ended up being a really important part of the project. That is doable. I mean, they'd be low resolution pictures, but maybe that's all you need.
That would be really super interesting. Would it significant? I mean, if your battery life with just sea surface temperature and GPS location is say 4 or 5 years, could you still get a year and a quarter out of it with the transmitting like once a week? Even?
It's not like you need to take a picture every hour.
No, I'm saying like once a week or even once a month would be interesting.
Right. So then it doesn't. I mean, the power budget is is hardly different at all from what it would be otherwise.
Interesting.
And
Now, in the globe,
we'd send it back in little like little packets of data. We'd use the smaller transmitter. We wouldn't need a high bandwidth transmitter either because we just send it back in little bits. It just take a while to
interesting.
get the picture back, but we could get it.
It's a bit like a space probe, isn't it? Where you've got a very limited budget.
In fact, Mars has a better connection than the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Wow. It's really a probe, a sea probe instead of a space probe.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, the ocean drifters are essentially an encased sphere that's connected by a tether to this drogue that's fairly deep underwater, and that sealed skin that holds in all the battery and the sensors and antenna, I guess, is also the flotation. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Now, in our case, the thing that floats that's of interest is this oddly shaped kind of oblong rectangular floaty thing, and we're quite interested in how it floats. We'd want to try to not disturb the way it floats as much as possible. How would you imagine attaching the transmitter and battery and sensors to something that's kind of irregularly shaped like that?
You'd want probably the smaller float or something because the bigger float, is probably 20 pounds or something, and the it probably
Yeah, I
see
guess how would
a
you like?
sphere is the best thing for it has the least resistance as opposed to your flaperon, which has a lot more resistance in water. So it's unlikely that the sphere will drag the flaperon around, but that you know there'll be some influence no matter what you attach to it. But what I would envision is putting it along a relatively long tether on it and attach it, which just have an attachment point. I mean, you're making the flaperon, right? So
Well, what we're trying to do is get a real one.
yeah, but you can machine some kind of. I mean, I could help with that, but
Okay.
you could put some kind of attachment point on there so that it had a shackle on there that
Oh,
we could
okay.
attach to. Yeah.
Oh, sure. So you're saying that you could potentially help with the machining?
Yeah, we could. I mean, send this to flaperon and we'll attach it for you.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting.
Well,
And the
another
time?
thing we could do
Yeah.
is we could put the batteries, the transmitter, the GPS receiver in the flaperon itself, and put one on each side that would be either one side would be facing up or the other,
Right.
and that would be the best because then you wouldn't have this thing hanging off the side of it.
That would be really great. And what you could do is when we got the flaperon and cut it down, we could then float it, mark the water line, and then make sure that when you put the stuff on it, it has more or less the same water line.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
It probably would, if
I mean,
given the
there's
weight
things
of
we can
these.
do. We can add buoyancy, blah blah blah. We can
Okay.
do that. It's not a problem. Um, yeah. Now remember, every when you put this thing in the water, when it doesn't have any growth on it, it'll float one way. But then if the barnacles grow like you're saying, then it's going to change the dynamics of this thing. And I know that whoever looked at this says that it doesn't look like it changed over time, but believe me, it did. It was in the water for quite some time, right?
So what we have is the pictures that the French took after they had taken it. Now, by this point, the lepus had dried out, and some of them had fallen off.
Yeah.
But they got by the time they got this thing to Toulouse, I think it was a week or two later, and they took the picture of that. So that's one data point. The other one is that the Australians, having got another flaperon and cut it down to match, put theirs in the water, and so presumably that's what you're going to aim for is to get it to float like the Australians did.
I think we could make it work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think honestly, now that we're talking about it, that'd probably be the best way to go is not to hang something from it because
Right,
it's a lot smaller than I assumed.
right.
But I think we can. I mean, we make little pucks, and we can. I mean, I can see integrating that into the device. It doesn't have to weigh that much at all.
How long do you think that kind of work would take? If I was to get you a flaperon, what kind of
Oh,
time
a
frame?
few months maybe.
A few months?
Yeah.
So what we would be aiming for would be getting it to you, giving you the time you need to do it, and
Uh-huh.
then transporting it to Perth, Australia,
Uh-huh.
and transporting it out over 1,000 miles of ocean, which is something not an insignificant job to take care of. The closest major city is Perth.
Oh,
Uh,
really? So where
yeah,
they think that landed, where it crashed?
for where they think it crashed. Yeah, it's
No.
1,000 miles. It was basically an arc, so it stretched along hundreds of miles. And the question is like, where exactly along that arc would it have gone? Um, but the the idea would be then to hopefully that it would track sort of basically the route of the gyre there, which kind of goes north and then west, and it eventually winds up near northern Madagascar, and so the Reunion Island, Mayotte, Rodriguez, um, those kind.
The French Met Office has deploys drifters and stores drifters in Reunion Island. If you talk to the French Met Service, Meteo France, they're the ones with that station in Reunion, and that's right along your path.
Right.
And they probably in some deployment cruises may, if they just pay attention to other drifters, they may take a day off, an
Right.
extra day, and pick up a drifter.
Okay, this is great. Andy, I feel like I'm off to the races. Thank you so much for taking the time. I will be getting back to you.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Whatever, it's fun.
that was actually a pretty condensed version of a discussion that Andy and I had about drifters and data and many other things. He gave me some good leads of other people to talk to, and he also gave me some really interesting ideas. It turns out that the more you turn over this idea and explore the possibilities, the more options emerge. So it's really exciting to hear his ideas and his enthusiasm for this idea. I think we're going to hear a lot more from him in the future. We're also going to hear from some other people who have other sets of expertise, and some of whom Andy has turned me on to. The upshot is that there's really a ton of potential data out there just waiting to be collected. With a little help, we can go out and get it. And that's where you guys come in. I know that a lot of you have been following this case passionately for years, and I think as a community, you could really help to make this happen if that's something that's interesting to you. So what I would really love is if in the comments of this video, if you could let me know what you think. Is this an idea that seems interesting to you? Is it something that you'd potentially like to pitch in on? For example, there's a lot of data on drifters. There's actually masses and masses of it. And it would be really useful to crowdsource going through that data and finding, for instance, drifters whose data would be particularly interesting that could lead us to interesting inquiries to make. And there's other ways too that you guys can help. So if that sounds interesting, if in broadest principle it sounds like any of you would be interested in helping out with, do let me know and I will move the ball forward in future podcasts where I'll explain what particularly I had in mind. Also, more ideas. If you guys think, oh, okay, I get it. What if we did X? What if we did Y? Let me know. I am all ears. So that's what I want to say on that topic today. I also want to do something I haven't done in a while, but Keely pointed out to me that it actually was a good feature and I think useful and helpful to people and also interesting, which is Community Radar. This was the segment that we did a while ago where I was basically trying to respond to things that were being said, discussed, asked, etc. in the comment section and elsewhere online. And I really want to get back to it. There's always interesting discussions going on in the comment section here and at the show page at findingmh370.com. What I want to talk about today comes from the comment section of the previous episode, which concerned how we could learn about the fate of MH370 from the way that the debris broke, right? And so one of the readers, Collins M999, wrote, Jeff, so I assume you fully support the findings of the TWA 800 report, i.e. 99% spark in the center fuel tank and 1% missile. Okay, so I had drawn the analogy to the case of TWA 800, which investigators later determined the cause of by looking at all the debris and figuring out the sequence of events of how the plane's pieces came apart. Now, I didn't really get into it in the show, but what the reader here is referencing is the fact that TWA 800 has probably gathered around itself more conspiracy theories and more passionate of a conspiracy community than any other case, with the possible exception of MH370. And the center around the idea that the plane didn't just blow up as a result of an accidental spark, but in fact it was shot down by a missile, and then all of that was covered up by the government, which doesn't want you to know about it. So when he says 99% spark in the center fuel tank and 1% missile, he's saying, well, you admit that there's like a 99% chance that it was an accident. I'm like, actually, okay, here's my response. I don't think it's 99%. I think it's 100%. I don't think that this is a realistic idea at all. Why? Okay, let me read the follow-up comment that Collins M999 wrote. It is statistically close to impossible for over 30 independent eyewitnesses to all be wrong in seeing something streak up towards TWA 800, and then when hitting it, a big explosion happens. Say 1 in a million chance in a peacetime place to see something streak up and hit or very close miss an aircraft at around 18,000 feet, and the explosion just caused by a short circuit in a fuel tank, also 1 in a million. So we have 1 million times 1 million, which is 1 in a, and then there was a 1 with like a whole bunch of zeros. Just with that, there is no need to spend the time putting the aircraft back together in a hangar. Okay, I get it. I know that a lot of people think that. A lot of people, this kind of reminds me of Florence Tshanghi's idea about MH370, which is it was shot down, governments are covering it up. This is the essence of a conspiracy idea, right? Which is that you have this theory and you don't have a lot of evidence for it, but you can explain a lack of evidence by saying that it's being suppressed, it's being covered up. And in fact, the fact that there isn't more evidence is actually evidence of a cover-up. So I respect that you have that opinion. I don't agree with that opinion, okay? Let me put it this way. In air accident investigation, it is a very well-known idea that if you've been doing this for a while, if you've studied multiple cases and you see patterns emerge over time, what I'm saying is if you're experienced at air accident investigation, you will know that eyewitness accounts are very, very unuseful in figuring out what happened. People see things, they misremember things. They're just it's very hard for people caught by surprise by an unexpected phenomenon to describe it accurately. And people can remember things after the case. So in MH370, we have a similar phenomenon. We have reports of people in the Maldives who saw a plane fly low overhead. An entire village saw this. How could it be that an entire village could be wrong about something like that? Well, there is a social contagion effect in misinformation. I think we understand how fallible memory is, how fallible perception is. Could 30 people all see the same thing? They report that they see a missile streaking upwards? Yes, they can all get that wrong. And in fact, I don't think that there is a reason to think that this plane was shot down. I know that that's not a very satisfying answer for Collins M999. I also am pretty confident that audience member has heard the skepticism before. I am not the first person to voice skepticism. This is kind of a clash of cultures in a sense. I mean, there's people who kind of hew to the narrow path, which I do. I'm a straight and narrow kind of accident investigation guy. And there's people who think that something's afoot, that the authorities are hiding something. Actually, this is a very interesting dynamic. I think it's really relevant to the fact that we don't understand what happened to MH370, or at least society as a whole has been able to grasp with the reality of this case, is partly because of the psychology of how we understand things. And I know that these kind of, when I talk about this sort of stuff in podcasts, it doesn't get the same kind of clicks as when I talk about stuff like debris, but it's important. So I will have to talk about it. This is a podcast that's dedicated to a comprehensive review of all of the evidence and all of the kind of meta context around the evidence as well. How we grapple with it. How do we understand things? How do we make sense of the world? And what does it mean to have a successful scientific theory? What does it mean to know something? Anyway, this is why we have to have humanities majors. Everyone says science is great, humanities are dumb. These things cannot be separated. You can't have understanding without philosophy. Okay? Anyway, veering off into the sublime there for a minute, but that's all I have for you today. I feel like this was a really exciting one. I feel like I've opened potentially a new front in the war to understand what happened to the missing plane. And I'm excited about the opportunity, if you guys are interested, to kind of pitch in and make it a more communal effort, even than it has been. As I said before, if you're not already subscribing and you could subscribe now, that would be particularly awesome. So thank you for that. I will leave you with my famous final words. Don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. See you next time.